One thing that we should know before we get started here is that we've gone on a journey through this Better Together webcast series. So, this is a five-part series. We started off with the journey to the private cloud back on January 14th, where you help to understand the critical criteria for a private cloud. And you should have received email invitations to all of these events. If you didn't attend the event live, hopefully you have a recording of the event so you can get up to speed on everything that Nutanix is doing. The second event was the Nutanix on Nutanix data consolidation in action. This was how Nutanix IT uses software defined storage for simplicity and flexibility. From there, the third event was how to succeed in a rapidly expanding and evolving infrastructure and operations world. Excellent event. The fourth event was how to protect your heterogeneous applications and data services. This is all about business continuity and disaster recovery. And finally, we are at the final event, which is today's event. And that is essential security considerations for building your private cloud. On today's event, you'll learn why security is everyone's responsibility, why replatforming for private and hybrid cloud needs new thinking around security, and how a focus on visibility and compliance for application security is the foundation for private cloud security. Before I introduce you to today's expert presenter, you should know that we want this to be an educational event. So we encourage you to use the questions box there in the control panel. And I see lots of great comments already coming in. Thank you for those. Thank you, everyone, for joining us around the world. Love to see where everyone's from. Love to see you on the event. Of course, if you have questions throughout, please use that questions box and ask us questions about enterprise security and the Nutanix solution. And we'll be queuing those up for the dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's event. We also have a number of handouts there in your audience console. The first one is a link actually to the Nutanix test drive. That's where you can try out Nutanix for yourself. There's the private cloud ebook available for download. And finally, the Nutanix Bootcamp series is also a link that's available in the handouts tab as well. And then prizes. Now, through this event series, for anyone who attended at least one of the events, if you met the qualifications and attended live, you should have received a Tango gift card. And then in the middle of the series, we gave away the first of our grand prizes. That was a new 16-inch MacBook Pro. And now on today's final event, we'll be giving out that final grand prize, which is another MacBook Pro. So the requirements to be eligible for the prize drawings are on our website. They're also there in the handouts tab. It's events.actualtechmedia.com. All grand prize winners must submit an IRS Form W-9, be present on the live event, and of course meet the other legalese, prize terms, and conditions. And with that, I'm excited to hand it over to today's expert presenter. That is Mr. Mike Wronski, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Nutanix.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, David. I appreciate the introduction. And so again, welcome everybody. I really appreciate your time today. I assume many of you are joining from my home office. I think I've got the kids tied up and the dog staked outside, so I won't hear any barking, screaming, or crying on this one, but definitely could happen with the new work from home model that we're all trying to get used to. So let's just get into it. Why are we here and what are we here to talk about? And I am with Nutanix, and what I really want to spend some time on with you today is what are security considerations for private cloud, and maybe spend some time making sure we understand what private cloud really means in our world. Now, security is one of these things that always comes up. There's always a discussion around it, and I think we're more attuned to it today than maybe we were in the past years, because things are escalating. I mean, the number of attacks, the number of times we see large business names show up in the media about a major security breach or a ransomware attack ruining their business, it's almost becoming weekly that we see these kind of events. And none of us wants to be at an organization, or even worse, in an IT role that maybe some responsibility is attributed to you for causing this event. So with all that growth in numbers, that's kind of why I say, security really is everyone's responsibility and something to think about. You may not be in a specific security role, but you may be in the position to be making IT decisions and architectural decisions that can either make your security more complex or make it easier or put a larger burden on yourself, between you and your security team, maybe even decisions that increase tension between you and your security team, because they're going to ask you to do things that either you don't know how to do or is complex to do in that environment. So if we start putting on the security responsibility hat in just about every aspect of your role in IT, my view and belief is that just makes it easier to help prevent these kind of attacks, whether it's going to be ransomware, the spoofing and email stuff that's going around, or all on assault against operations through denial of service type of things. So let's maybe switch over now and spend some time on private cloud and really what we mean by private cloud. To many and in the past, virtualization became someone's cloud, right? I'm no longer a physical data center. I'm virtualized. It's a cloud. But what I mean, and this is in line with what Nutanix's definition of private cloud is really moving towards a services-based infrastructure. It is, think about how many ways can I make my on-premises IT and data center infrastructure act and operate as close to a traditional public cloud service like Azure or AWS as possible. So, the reasons why is streamlining. You want to have quicker access to resources, quick provisioning of things. There's also a strong desire to move towards cloud native. There's probably some Kubernetes talk in your organization. How do we start using containers and Kubernetes? If the infrastructure isn't well aligned to those goals, there's a good chance you're going to have trouble serving that audience, and they may go somewhere else. They may go out to public cloud. You may end up things like shadow IT, where they're creating and doing things outside of your control, and that can be a security construct. DevOps and automation, again, the more API driven, service oriented, the easier it will be to embrace a DevOps philosophy and have that constant integration and development pipeline and rolling out quick changes, as opposed to really large waterfall efforts that, as we all know, slow things down. Then we get topics of like mobility, and there's multiple reasons for mobility. One can be in a more of a grandeur type use case. I've never been a big believer in cloud bursting per se, as we all know that there's physics involved in this aspect of how do we achieve that. But the other aspect is is there a reason to move things from one cloud to another? Is it a cost-based reason? Or I think, as many are seeing right now in scenarios where there is a natural disaster or acts of God, are there opportunities to maneuver or push workloads into a new cloud environment, create new disaster recovery scenarios? So mobility is definitely enhanced by moving towards a true private cloud scenario where it is much more API driven and maybe container focused for some applications as well. And another reason why moving towards private cloud is to try to reduce the complexity that's provisioned by some of these applications. If we have hundreds and hundreds of services, lots and lots of containers, the opportunity there is to create complexity. And creating a lot of complexity isn't going to be good for cost. It's not good for visibility. So we're looking to private cloud to potentially eliminate some of our infrastructure complexity to give us time to deal with the complexity that we're introducing with moving to some of these new technologies and new things. And, as we all know, the complexity of today tends to be easier later, but that's really a learning curve kind of a discussion. Which really does bring me into that complexity part and what that means to security. Complexity is absolutely the enemy of security. The harder things are to understand, or the number of moving parts where maybe it's not all even well understood. If you think about lots of tacit knowledge from legacy applications, or how many different vendors are involved between delivering your IT infrastructure, between true traditional data networking or storage networking and SAN vendors, backup appliances, security appliances, virtualization tools, operationally monitoring tools. Every one of those things is deployed on your network and probably has a level of configuration that's required to ensure that it's used in a proper way to prevent data breach and things. And we see this many times with some of the data that's out there. So there's a number of researchers, and one I've gotten like bold here is a pretty staggering, interesting fact. And the prediction is that really most cloud security failures aren't due to security vulnerabilities. I think a lot of us think, oh, it's the hacker exploiting this vulnerability. But a lot of times it's a hacker exploiting a misconfiguration. And we've seen a lot of evidence of that. There's been many breaches of Amazon S3 storage out there that caused all kinds of private data to be exposed. And it turns out that the S3 data bucket was just provisioned in a very open manner. It was open readable to the world. And we know how that stuff happens, right? It's I'm doing a test or doing a proof of concept internally. You configure something out, you test that POC, and then you blink your eye and someone's put it into production. And did anyone go back and double check that it was, did you follow all of the AWS best practices to secure that and lock it down? Is role-based access control in place and all that? So that's really where that comes down to. And that really does lead me to that multiple approach bullet that I've got on this slide is every vendor has a way to secure their product. It may not comprehend interaction. It is us as IT practitioners that will mix and match different vendors' tools and applications to provide the solutions that we have. So, and the complexity there is it becomes up to us to decide, well, does vendor A's security model match with vendor B's? And if I apply their best practices, do they still work together? That's a big concern, which requires, some decent amount of testing. And that may be why certain things aren't always enacted to their fullest, because at the end of the day, we need to deliver services. And if there's a fear that turning on a configuration or making a strict security change could break functionality, you tend to err on the side of continuing service versus erring on the side of tight security. So we need to be able to work through that from a complexity perspective. And I believe what I just kind of worked through really is to tie it together in that coverage gaps is all this complexity just means that there are things that get left out. There are portions that are insecure or forgotten due to lack of knowledge, right? We don't know what we don't know from what we're supposed to pay attention to in the complexity of our modern data centers. So another aspect of security in the private cloud, hybrid cloud world is we used to define security very easily in terms of perimeters. You've probably heard the term defense in depth, right? So it's like as I get closer and closer to the key data, I've got more and more rings or more perimeters of security tools. So whether that we go to the most basic idea of our physical data center, it has a lock on the door. That was one level of security. Then when you got inside the data center, there might be locks on the cabinets, that kind of a thing. Or from a network perspective, you have your firewall, and 20 years ago, the firewall was it, and you trusted everything inside the firewall and you distrusted everything outside the firewall. Then we started creating more and more firewalls and more network segmentation, more VLANs and things. All interesting, but now we've got SaaS, public cloud, service architecture. Drawing a line in like if you print out an Excel or a diagram per se, what's the perimeter? We don't know. Perimeters are hard to define, and if you can't define a perimeter, it becomes hard to secure using that technology model of using firewalls or network segmentation. So now we're left to the perimeters are policy either more logically, where I have logical policies, I'm going to secure a number of things and group them together and create a bunch of policy around it, or network policy for restricting things at the other layer. But the topic I'm trying to come up with here is we have to change our thinking now, because the old security models may not work when I'm trying to mix and match an application that's defined by directory services coming from a public cloud, data coming from a Salesforce or a ServiceNow site, internal data in a database, and then a web front end that might be located in two places or multiple regions. So the perimeter is hard to define, therefore also very hard to secure. And that really does kind of play into really where we're going to start talking about next in the session. But I want to leave you with some of the Gartner portions of this, and this is a great note. If you're looking at top security risk trends, Gartner had their paper come out just in February of this year, but it really does highlight that there is no expectation this is going away. In fact, it's going to keep increasing, and you're going to see more and more disruption, more data loss. As I think I did read something just very topically today, that as companies are working and struggling to figure out how to do work from home, as we all decide how to work in this new environment under this virus and pandemic, they're seeing already an uptick of hackers trying to figure out how to exploit this new work generation. Are there laptops and things be working from home environments that aren't secured the same way? So we will expect to see more and more velocity and more creativity in the coming months into this. So as we're making decisions about either if it's temporary things on how to expand work from home, or as we're starting to plan upgrading and modifying our traditional data centers, moving towards a more cloud forward and hybrid cloud or a private cloud model, keeping security in mind and how we're going to deal with these things must be a key priority in that decision-making process. So let's kind of dig in here a little bit into some of those considerations into what we're thinking about. One of those considerations is how much of this responsibility really should be only in the customer or yours as the implementer. The traditional model, and I'm sure that, if I could see you or hear your heads nodding, is that the onus has always been on the implementation to figure out how to secure it. A vendor would give you essentially a barely configured device or unconfigured software, and there would be two different configuration guides, one to drive the software function, and then there's this other manual that you may or may not even have read that's how to configure it securely, or the software hardening guide. Really, that shouldn't necessarily always be our responsibility as implementers to do. The ideal case is, why not understand that all customers now, not just some, expect to deliver a secure service? Why not ship and deploy that software as secure as possible and minimize the amount of effort that is required implementation time to do security? So we should be looking for that, and that's done in multiple ways. One is that during testing and assessments, this is something you can ask your vendors. Are you doing secure code review? Are you doing penetration testing or network vulnerability scanning against your QA environments and identifying things that are insecure in part of your internal testing, so that by the time it gets to me as customer, that's not something I have to deal with. You're just removing those vulnerabilities or open configurations by default. So absolutely pay attention to that and make sure this is something that your vendors are really looking at. And the other portion of this is how much additional software, additional controls do you need? How much is built in? So thinking about, does the software package I'm looking at, is it leave everything up to me? Do I have to go out and look for a number of third-party solutions? Or does it have native features and functions that are going to help me in my goals, whether that's just for general security, or maybe you're looking at regulatory compliance and you have things like HIPAA for healthcare, or if you're PCI, I'll pick on the data at rest encryption one here. Both of those compliance standards, whether it's patient data or credit card information, if you're storing that information in your data center, you're required to be encrypt that data at rest to be compliant. So ideally you want to be able to do that quickly. So what's the cost model? What does that look like? So for each one of the features and functions that you need to secure something, you're going to look at your primary software vendor and then make a decision on what they provide cover you, or do I have to make a additional consideration? It might be a different piece of software. Maybe it's how you choose your hardware and what to buy. But what I want to make clear in this consideration is looking at each one of these things, and these are some of the bigger buckets that I think you should pay attention to. How much identity and authentication do they have? Does that software support two factor, which is a common best practice, and we see a lot of that with our own personal banking apps and things, where you either get the weak version where they send you a text message, or more secure ones that you have a special app generating a one-time code, or the super secure key fob type that we all may know from the old days of the RSA key fobs. Those still exist, but that's really that multi-factor side, and everybody's looking to have that. So does it integrate well with your Active Directory? Does it have that piece of technology available to it? How much role-based access control does it have? Can you segment down to the concepts of least privilege or zero trust, only allowing those who need to have access to each feature and function or raw access the data, and how hard that is to configure in the software should absolutely be a consideration. And then the last one is, how involved is your vendor in doing compliance and certification standards? Are they looking at common criteria? Do they have encryption certifications? If they're running a SaaS-based service or anything database, are they looking at some of the NIST things or the other portions of this to make sure that their operations that might be hosting your data or virtual machines are also following these security best practices, and where it makes sense to be certified, are they also certified? So keep that consideration in mind as well when you're thinking about your general private cloud thought processes. So another aspect of all this is, when I've really talked about, configuration and hardening as a day zero, installation aspect, but that's not really the case, right? It'd be great if day zero was it, if every piece of software or application we deployed was a set it and forget it. We know that's not the case. There is ongoing maintenance. There is times where you're doing troubleshooting and diagnostics, where you're digging under the covers, maybe getting into operating systems and command line, and all of those different activities have an opportunity to potentially disable or misconfigure something that was turned on from a security hardening perspective. So again, automation is key here. Automation for two areas. One in the area of double checking and auditing the system. How is it able to give you a quick check and, hey, you know what, somebody turned off some inter-application firewalls, or a local user was created. And those things may, like I said, they may have been done as part of some diagnostic or standard maintenance, and what was forgotten was to turn them back on at the end of that maintenance period. So in that same vein as that I spoke about earlier, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the onus of the implementer to do this. Ideally, it'd be great if the system would say, hey, I detected a bunch of things that are deviating from our best practice security hardening guides. You may want to double check those and set them back. Or in the perfect scenario, it just self-heals automatically. So that's the kind of automation that really helps ensure that security is constantly being done, because we're always provisioning new things. Maybe you're expanding and adding new services. Maybe you're expanding the infrastructure and adding new components. So that's all that beyond day zero type of security hardening that we want to make sure we're covering. So the more automation and self-healing that's built into the software and systems that we deploy, the less onus it is on us as the implementers to make sure about that. And this automation concept even applies to virtual machine or workload provisioning. If you're using a automation orchestration tool set, there's an opportunity there to have those workloads deployed in the secure best practice and built into your templates and your blueprints. So those automation tools, if they're tightly integrated into that infrastructure, are they applying the firewall policies? Are they also categorizing things so that they fall into your role-based access control, including categorization for things like synchronization. So for high availability and you're replicating data and applications, maybe you have a general policy that all tier 1 databases have to get put into a replication schedule to make sure that should something happen to my primary data center, that tier 1 data is available. So again, the automation aspect of that is key to look into and employ that automation aspect, so that when bad things happen, they will happen. We all know that there's no perfect scenario or perfectly secure product, but the data is safe, and then we've got our business continuity can just kick in, and then we can keep on going with operations and haven't lost access to any of our data. And that's one, when I kind of bring this up, I bring up a statistic here and I try to share this, and you'll know I think we're going to make this deck available, and if not, I'll make sure that David and Actual Tech do share it out. But there's another readiness report, and I think it's very interesting that they highlight that even vendors that are asked, are you prepared and do you have the knowledge? Most of them rank themselves as cyber novices, because they know that they don't have enough staffing and enough people that are trained beyond maybe a few security professionals in their org that are thinking about this stuff. So this is another data point that goes back to that. So it really is everyone's responsibility to think about it. I don't think there's an expectation that everyone is a security domain expert, but having some level of general thought process around, am I making a right decision? Should I be consulting someone about the security of this before I make a major purchase or an architectural decision? That part should at least be top of mind. So we'll bring us into consideration number 4, and this is a little bit philosophical as well as technical implementation. So, and you're probably hearing more and more of this. The concept of zero trust is not necessarily a new one. I think it was Forrester, another analyst firm, and some others that started talking about this a number of years ago. But at a highest level, zero trust is the idea of least privilege. And least privilege means across all areas of my environment, am I restricting access to, if it's people, to what they need to use to get their job done, from a user access control. If it's a role-based access control for management, does my network operations center or my operations center people, do they have only available access to look at statistics and maybe do some basic restarts? Are my architects allowed to make more changes? Do I have that level of control where I'm able to segment users by what they need to get their job done, keeping them efficient, but not being overly open where they're, should a bad actor or someone get a hold of their credentials, they're not able to jump in and really steal everything from underneath us. Now, thinking about this in a little bit more detailed way, at the network level, zero trust, I think it's very interesting. Now, I'll throw in another concept you've probably heard a lot of, is the term of microsegmentation. Microsegmentation is the idea of firewalling at its native aspect, but really, really granular. So I think we've all had the ability in operating systems, whether that's been Linux with IP tables or the native firewall in Windows desktop or Windows servers, to leverage a firewall at the server or the OS level and put in some basic ruling. But microsegmentation is a part of that. But when you combine microsegmentation with zero trust, I think that's where things get interesting. How can I leverage all of this ability to firewall at a very granular level and limit to least privilege? So that would be, I guess, that's the golden, whether you want to call that rainbows and unicorns. That's why I say it's a philosophy, it's an aspiration to get to zero trust, not something you could just flip a switch and get. But when we get to the point where we're only allowing required traffic with the required users, that eliminates a giant amount of attack surface from our environments. The trouble with this is it may not be that easy. Legacy applications, what protocols, what ports do they use? What do they talk to? There may not be anyone in your org still working there that knows, right? It just works, right? Don't touch it. We don't want to get any dust on it. It's sitting in the corner. It does its job. Somebody from IBM and the AS400 group comes in and changes the oil in that thing every once in a while, but we don't want to touch it because we don't understand it. So that's why I bring up, if you're thinking about zero trust, which you should be, and if you're thinking about doing it at the network level of really micro-segmenting applications and other aspects of it, visualization is going to be a key consideration. Does the software, do I have the right tooling to understand what communicates to what and make a good, valid decision on what's a good policy and what's not? So a combination of being able to visualize the traffic, being able to do discovery, grouping, and categorization. Oh, these are all SQL servers. These are all web servers. These are all sitting behind a load balancer or something. That kind of grouping also, the more dynamic and automated that is, the better. Just being able to categorize is a step one, and automatic dynamic categorization is another step two. And these things all fall into being able to successfully implement microsegmentation in an environment and really get the benefits out of the zero trust concept, and without having to really limit yourself to doing only macro level things, as which we've done in the past. Well, I put everything on one VLAN and segment a bunch of VLANs, but if there's two virtual machines sitting next to each other on the same VLAN and one of them isn't patched, somehow compromised, that allows a lot of spread. But if I've done detailed micro segmentation, maybe you don't allow communication between front-end web servers because they don't ever talk to each other. They only talk down to application servers. So I think you can start to understand that there is a huge benefit in doing microsegmentation, but you do want to consider, do I have the tooling? And then, of course, where do I start? Do I start on top line applications? Do I start where I have the most understanding? My best practice suggestion to all of you is to absolutely start somewhere, consider doing this, and then leverage those applications that you think you understand the best, and start applying these concept of zero trust across your networks, as well as your network security configurations everywhere possible. You're never going to get a wholesale switch, so start in small consumable chunks and move towards that as best you can. And as I mentioned earlier, so we don't want to have downtime. There are huge penalties. I started off with some pretty staggering statistics about the cost of breaches in large enterprises. They go up to the billions of dollars. There's no such thing as 100% recoverability or 100% protection, but we need to keep implementing more and more controls and more detailed controls under the mindset of not causing ourselves excessive pain, complexity, or cost. It has been my experience over my 25 plus years of IT background in both the vendor and the practitioner side, is cost has been a huge one, where things are not done because I thought it felt to be too expensive. There's always ways around that. Pay attention to that, but absolutely do what you can to help the security team in your decisions as architects in making the right choices that make your lives easier and prevent these kind of data breaches, so that your company or your organization isn't under the microscope because of the next big breach. So that kind of brings me to rolling some of this up and spending a little bit of time talking about how Nutanix could possibly help in these scenarios. And throughout this series, you've heard quite a bit about Nutanix helping build private clouds and the role of hyperconverged infrastructure in really modernizing and digitizing data centers from the traditional model to its being more of a cloud-first hybrid cloud scenario. When we start putting on our security hats and thinking about the same concepts, Nutanix hits on a number of the items that I just talked to you about as best practices. One of those things you've probably heard us talk many times about, the concept of one-click operations. And that is a philosophy of Nutanix on trying to make things as simple as possible, removing the minutia tasks, anything that's repeatable should be automated. So we've applied that to security. We have a number of native security features. A lot of that's built in and tied into compliance goals and reporting. There is a level of application and microsegmentation security, and we also partner with a lot of security vendors, and I'm going to dig into those in a little bit to really expand that beyond on what really touches what Nutanix is doing, but also touches on how to secure the greater environment in a more integrated way. So I would argue that HCI in itself, so hyperconvergence, gets you closer and more secure because it eliminates complexity, right? As I started off with this talk, removing complexity is a positive step in the security direction because you're able to do things more efficiently and there's less open gaps and holes. So we already see that by trimming down the infrastructure and letting the converging these different functions, there's less components to worry about. In the Nutanix world, those components are secured and hardened. So as I mentioned earlier, that's a great thing to have. What Nutanix has done is exactly as I said earlier, expect that it's hardened from factory as much as possible. What we do from our perspective is deliver a secure hardening guide, which is delivered in two ways, both programmatically, meaning we harden it from factory. We provide a printed out hard copy that's usable by compliance and auditors to know what the best practice is and how it's been applied. But all of those baselines that are about of those designs are automatically audited and can be remediated in automatic function as well. Then things like data protection. So all the different replication types, whether that's synchronous data replication, quick snapshots, backup and replication are going to be key to a strategy to defeat ransomware. So if ransomware gets in your environment, one of the first things that anyone has to do is look back in time and says, well, when do we think this got in? And do we have backups or snapshots from a time prior to encryption by ransomware? That's where your data point is going to be to go back to. So if all of that is built in and native to the system, there's a better chance of utilizing those techniques to give yourself protection against that ransomware. And then, of course, control, authorization, governance has to be native to the platform. You have to be able to go back through and audit who can do what and be able to set role-based access control and all those configuration portions to limit who's doing what and where, getting detailed audit logs into security tooling and other audit tooling as well as even have software to audit both your on-premises and your cloud-based infrastructure to ensure that it's secured and hardened perfectly or appropriately to best practices. So all of these things are native portions of Nutanix and our core HCI software platform. Going a little bit deeper into that is the application network security that falls under that concept I mentioned to you earlier about zero trust and microsegmentation. I wholeheartedly believe that the only success there is through understanding the environment. So you will not have any success securing something that you don't understand how it operates. So a lot of attention has been given to visibility within the infrastructure that is we can provide network security through a product we call Flow. Being able to visualize not just segments, meaning I want to segment, say, a dev test environment from a production environment, or I want to separate out by business units, but also being able to visualize communication through, say, a three-tiered application, understand that what's going between a web server and an application server and a database server that are all combined together to provide that application infrastructure. So visualizing and writing policy against all those things is hugely important from a security perspective. And something else that's hugely important to all of this is switching to a software model. So the traditional way of doing network segmentation was maybe creating a VLAN, and then we would put firewall constructs between VLANs. So every security segment, new VLAN, new port in the firewall, whether that virtual or physical, and a complex set of policies. That's a lot of moving parts to achieve that. The advent of virtual networking and the concept of software-defined networking gives us the point to have software-defined security, meaning that I can change security posture, I can add policies and rules, I can create new segments, never touching VLANs, never reconfiguring any of that, and never having to worry about scaling out physical firewall devices for certain applications. So the use cases we have for our software-defined networking and security products is, doing that discovery and visibility. How do my applications communicate? Nice specialized use case that I think is especially topical now is being able to add additional security into virtual desktop environments through identity. Understanding who is using a desktop is very important, and it also simplifies the rollout. So much like the scenario I just told you, where we would do VLANs and separate segmentation, a lot of times virtual desktops are segmented that way as well. One network pool, one network for contractors, one for employees. A lot of complexity, a lot of scale. If I can dynamically change that policy based on who the user is, then I can simplify the VDI infrastructure and still get a huge level of control between remote workers, non-employee contractors, and employees. And as those roles change, just automatically adapt the security controls based through software and not any physical changes or reconfiguration of my VDI environment. And lastly, provide network and application segmentation at a very granular level that will prevent malware spread and give me that protection that we're looking for to prevent the different scenarios that I covered earlier in the talk. Architecturally, I'll just build this out for you really quickly so you can get an idea of what this looks like. Doesn't matter what your network look like. You can have a large flat network with one VLAN. You could have 70 VLANs in the most complex network anyone's ever seen. And still, because it's software-based, segment out into web app and DB. It's a 3-tiered application scenario, defining policies all through software. So what we're really saying here is works with whatever your network is, not putting a lot of onus on the networking team or to recreate VLANs or change what they're doing, but still being able to provide very granular security policy at the network level. And that truly is the best benefit of a software-defined network security product in the same vein as all the discovery and visibility that I talked about earlier. Another area of this that I think is worth talking about is what about other things, not just firewalling. So what we have done is really integrate with all of the top networking vendors to make sure that they're getting the visibility and control they need across the entire infrastructure. Networking vendors all provide amazing smart fabrics these days. It's not the same networks of many years ago where the networks were fairly dumb. Now, absolutely smart fabric. They can do all things like network VLANing, pruning, creation, stretch layer 2, and we provide hooks into Nutanix to ensure that all of the goodness that they provide works really well to what we're doing on the virtual side. Same as the network security vendors, where you're looking to say, what, not only do I want to limit down to what's required traffic, but what if a malicious user is tunneling through expected traffic patterns or ports and protocols between two servers? Then we're getting into the area of deep packet inspection, threat intelligence, next-gen firewalling. You can pick your term there. There's a number of vendors that do this really well. You may have standardized on some of these in your environment. So all of these vendors can integrate really well into both our pinpointing that through our networking, as well as automation through deployment and repeatability through automation and orchestration tools provided by Nutanix. So it's a win-win across deploying these appliances and network devices and inserting them between your virtual machines in your environment. And now we'll kind of round this out with the compliance portion of that. So Nutanix has a component that allows the ability to both audit on-premises Nutanix as well as any public cloud environments, looking for that misconfigured S3 bucket, as I mentioned earlier, as well as are you using the network security rules? Do you have encryption disabled? So that is that last window into all of the other things I talked about within the this discussion here, is going ahead and detecting areas where I may have misconfigured something across my public and private cloud Nutanix environments, providing remediation in the areas of either suggestions or automated remediation, and then tying that all together with reporting so that I can prove to my auditors that all of these things have been covered and that I'm following these best practices within the different environments. And that's just that kind of that last topic, which I probably should have as my fifth consideration is, do you have all the things in place for reporting is that really will come up, especially if you're an audited or governed environment where, like, say, PCI, HIPAA, or if you're in Europe and following one of the European standards, you have to have audit evidence. So the more the software tooling that you choose provides that information, the easier your lives will be to provide it to your security teams and, of course, the auditors that they're speaking with. So I know I've covered a lot of things here, and hopefully many of them have piqued your interest into Nutanix a little bit more, and you're asking for more details. So easiest way, there's a lot of coverage of security in general on our website, Nutanix.com. If you do Nutanix.com/trust, you'll get quite a bit on the security compliance and different certifications that we have. We do offer lots of hands-on boot camps as well. So that's where you're able to get a hands-on time in a small setting. I think these are going to be very virtual these days as opposed to in person, but I'm sure the regular boot camp schedule will resume soon. And then lastly, there's also a test drive opportunity where with a few clicks, you're provisioned an environment in a public cloud scenario. We can get some stick time on Nutanix. Some of the products that I talked about and features are part of that test drive now, and some of them are coming soon from the security perspective. But I would still urge you to take a look and jump on that test drive scenario. So with that, I think it's time to spend some time on questions. And I'm going to ask David to come back and hopefully help me moderate some of this. Let's see if we can dig into what the audience has to say and what questions they might have.
Absolutely. Yeah, Mike. We do have some great questions coming in here for you from the audience. All right. So let's see. First question. There's a question here about evaluation licenses. Is there any sort of Nutanix evaluation that people can do?
Absolutely. So, if you're completely new to Nutanix, then the option I would say is either test drive, or we have something called a hosted POC that runs the entire Nutanix infrastructure in one of our data centers, and you access it over a remote desktop. And within that, they give you full license to run everything on that we have. If you are a Nutanix customer and you're just looking at some of these security features and functions, the Flow product has an online trial, so you can enable it within your management. Beam product for compliance is also a couple clicks within management to turn that on. If you're not using some of the encryption tools because of export licensing, I think your sales team or your Nutanix partners will have to get a temporary test license for you because of the export encryption rules. But outside of that, everything I spoke about in this session has an eval associated with it where you can try it at home.
Excellent. Excellent. Let's see. There's another question here about how is private cloud different from a virtual data center for security?
Right, excellent. So I think really security concepts are going to be the same everywhere, but as I mentioned in the consideration now, is as we move towards more cloud and we're stretching and losing these perimeters, when everything was in our own data center, things were a little bit easier to understand. And it is our belief that when we talk about private cloud, it is two things. It is the idea of moving towards a service-oriented architecture where our stakeholders are provisioning things on their own, possibly a lot more automation. So in those realms where things are automated, it is not a manual human intervention process. All the different security considerations have to be built into that automation tool. We don't want to have a really cool automated process with a service-oriented architecture that has a huge stop where someone has to get a ticket and manually go make configuration changes as part of a deployment, because then it's not quite the same user experience as with a public cloud. So as we move towards this the private cloud model and then embrace public, where I'm bringing in outside portions, that security consideration has to change because the perimeter has changed and it's not easy to define. And it's, for lack of a better term, like I said, no hard perimeter, software-based perimeters. Policy being the perimeter. So then, the virtualized data center of the past, I was making a general assumption that it wasn't pulling all these other portions in, and we hadn't gone fully service oriented. And that's, the base policies of zero, all the things I talked about probably apply there, but the considerations are different now because of the automation and the public cloud interaction.
Okay. Got it. Excellent. Let's see, another question here. Can I deploy Nutanix on existing hardware?
So that's I'm going to give my favorite technology SE answer on that one. It depends. And that's really because we do have a specific hardware compatibility list. There is a chance that that's true. Look into speak with your partners and your Nutanix sales professionals on the currently set of supported hardware platforms. If you're leveraging one of those and it meets that hardware criteria, it's probably a better chance. But I don't want to give a specific perfect answer on that one because it depends. Now, if you are thinking about more of a lab, I really want to try something out. We do have something called Nutanix CE or Community Edition. This is really a community-supported, your mileage may vary software that has got no support from Nutanix at a corporate level, is really a community-supported product. It may run on your generic hardware, but it really is for testing, trial, really playing around and getting familiar in a lab environment. It is not supported for anything production-wise, so that's really maybe a different question, but it is another way to get your hands on Nutanix and try it out.
Okay, excellent. That's very cool. I need to get that up and running in my own lab as well. Another question here, with many apps moving to the public cloud, should I still be looking at on-prem solutions? I'm betting you might have heard that question before.
There's always going to be TCO ROI discussions where things don't make sense in the public cloud, especially over long term for predictable applications. The total cost model may not make sense. There are data protection reasons why we're going to have on-prem portions of data. And then sometimes physics comes into play. As I mentioned earlier, there's no such thing as cloud bursting. So if you're looking at having portions of data in one location or another, there may be no conceivable reason that all data can be moved back and forth. And there's a lot of analyst data to support that. There's been a number of reports that have shown that there's a lot of repatriation going on within the environment where data is coming back from public clouds, either because it turned out to be way too expensive to run and couldn't control it and we can do it cheaper. I think a lot of the reason people thought public cloud was less expensive or the better location was because of their on-premises infrastructure wasn't efficient or wasn't cloud-like. So as we move towards private cloud deployments and really embracing hybrid cloud modeling, then we start making real business decisions based on if I'm getting the same operational model, if I've reduced the cost model and the efficiency down to make my on-prem look a lot more like public, the decision structure is different. The idea that all things go to cloud may work for some businesses, but absolutely doesn't work for all. So I urge you to step back and really do a long-term analysis and take a look at some of the research on repatriation and the reasons why some of these organizations are coming back on-prem to deploy their infrastructure so that you don't make the same mistakes that others may have made already.
Yeah, that's great advice. In fact, I did an hour-long webinar with Steve Kaplan, who's Nutanix's, I'll just call him Chief ROI Officer, for lack of a better term, all about his book that's available for free from Nutanix. It's an ebook called The ROI Story. And I found it really fascinating, all the calculations that he does to help companies determine, if they should move to the public cloud or if they should keep their applications and data on premises. And almost all the time or most of the time, he helps them, show that it's much better to keep things on premises. So a very interesting ebook. If you want to go look for it, just, Google Nutanix ROI Story, and I'm sure you can download it at no cost. Let's see, another question here. With so many people working from home, can Nutanix help with VDI or BYOD solutions?
Yep, so absolutely. So Nutanix has long been, in fact, that's really where we cut our teeth with HCI, a great platform for end user computing and VDI. So, beyond that portion, so if you're looking at deploying that net new, I would absolutely urge you to consider hyperconvergence from Nutanix to do that. And then you'll recall that I also mentioned the fact that our Nutanix Flow product helps secure VDI even better with that microsegmentation and identity-based policies. So companies deploying these infrastructures can add additional security. And as we do things now, which I think where people are rushing to deploy things quicker, the built-in nature of the additional security component is going to help them achieve a secure VDI infrastructure as opposed to it being an afterthought. So I think it absolutely can help. And if you're interested in getting more details, again, reach out to your Nutanix sales professionals and ask them for a demonstration or further detail on what we can do there.
Okay, nice. Another question, can Nutanix help with ransomware?
Yeah, now ransomware is a hot topic and it's a tough one. So any vendor that tells you they can prevent it is probably pulling your leg a bit. But the combination of things that Nutanix offers, I think, are definitely within our tool chest to help prevent ransomware. So the first set of things is all of that data availability and the resilience side, being able to have native snapshots and replication out to multiple sites gives me that recover point prior to ransomware aspect. So how do I get back to the state where the data wasn't encrypted by the ransomware vendor, so I'm not trying to figure out how to buy $1 million worth of Bitcoin to pay these things off. The other aspect of that is how ransomware is spreading. It started off, was really focused a lot at end user desktops at one point, where it was encrypting desktops, but now what we're seeing is ransomware is moving inside the data center, using vulnerabilities or open access points to get into servers and encrypt physical servers and the data they're attached to. And if we think about how modern malware spreads host to host looking for other vulnerabilities, microsegmentation is a great use case for helping prevent that. The more I've microsegmented, the more I've gone down the path of zero trust, the less surface attack area that malware may have to spread. So yes, maybe it gets into a front-end web server, but front-end web servers typically don't have important data that a ransomware vector is going to care about. So easy to recover, easy to redeploy, as opposed to it spreading all the way down the stack to my databases. So, a combination of microsegmentation, zero trust, and snapshots, replication are a good set of tools to implement as part of your ransomware prevention strategy.
Excellent, excellent. I know a lot of companies really need that today. So next question, what are the options or best practices for threat intelligence or deep packet inspection?
Oh, another good one, and I did cover it very, very lightly. And this is an area where Nutanix right now is not looking at being one of those vendors. All of the security threat intelligence vendors have years and years of expertise. They have honeypots, and they curate, they create signatures. They do a lot of deep security research. So there's always going to be a desire to implement some of their products within a Nutanix environment. So our go-to-market and our partnering philosophy is to embrace all of those vendors and make it as easy as possible for you to insert their software into a Nutanix virtual environment. So it's typically done through something called service chaining or insertion, service and chaining, service insertion, that essentially lets you put the virtual version of one of those security appliances between virtual machines or between virtual network segments to ensure that that threat intelligence is being collected, or that you're doing additional network inspection, whether that's next gen firewall or deep packet inspection on those entities. But I would say the majority of major vendors are partnered with Nutanix. We have a number of them listed on our website. So just check with the alliances side on the website if your vendor of choice is out there, and if it's something that's missing, absolutely ask, and we're happy to tell you where we are with that partnership.
Awesome. So I'm curious, is Flow just for microsegmentation, or does it do other firewall functions as well?
It's a little bit nuanced, David, but it does and performs very well for that what I would call, I don't know if it's macro, micro, I'm not really a good term for this, but where I want to say separate dev tests from production, or I want to separate networking virtual machines that are in, say, one business unit from another. I can do that with Flow. I can create those larger segmentation realms of many virtual machines that are together and create that level of segmenting. Or things, if I'm doing, more of a service provider style segmentation, where this is client A, this is client B. Again, I'm doing larger level segmentation. Perfectly suitable for that, and because it's software defined, it's fairly simple to implement. And then, it also allows me to get micro segmented within those segments. So I can have a test dev, and then I can segment, my build machines from my testable workloads and all that as well. So it is a building block for doing all kinds of firewall activity. What it's not intended for use is like a gateway firewall device. It is not your gateway or your NAT device. That's where we would, go ahead and recommend or tell you about other networking partners that can provide that level of functionality.
Excellent. Well, I learned a lot. I know the audience did as well. Mike, I'm afraid we're out of time for our Q&A, but thank you so much for being on the event today.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I always enjoy it. And to everyone else, I appreciate your time, and everyone, stay positive and stay healthy out there.
Absolutely. And thank you to Nutanix for supporting today's event. I pasted in the chat box there, or the questions box, the link to the ROI Story ebook if you want to check that out. Also in the handouts tab, you'll find the links to the Nutanix test drive, the Nutanix private cloud ebook, and the Nutanix bootcamp as well. And before we go, I want to announce the winner of the 16-inch MacBook Pro that we're giving out today. This is going to Caleb Wilson of Illinois. Congratulations, Caleb Wilson of Illinois. Best of luck to everyone on future events. After this event, in fact, you'll be redirected automatically to our website, where we're running a number of other events, including the Nutanix Data Center Madness event, which looks like this, where we're giving out 5 PlayStation 4 Pros with NBA 2K20. For those of you who are working from home, this might be helpful. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on the event today. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that you had a good time. I really enjoyed this Nutanix Better Together webinar series. If you haven't watched the previous events, make sure you check those out as well. Thank you again to Mike for joining us, and thank you, everyone. Have a great day. See you next time.